"Sir, remove all metal objects. You're holding up the line," the TSA agent barked impatiently. The elderly man fumbled with his threadbare jacket, hands trembling as he tried to comply. "I said move it," the agent snapped, loudly enough for everyone to hear. The old man's eyes remained fixed on the floor. 10 minutes later, as the same agent reached for the small wooden box in the old man's carry-on, a senior TSA official appeared. "Stop! Step away from that box," he commanded, his voice cutting through the noise. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he snapped to attention and saluted. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches, you make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Frank Simmons stood patiently in the security line at Reagan National Airport, his weathered hands resting lightly on his worn leather suitcase. At 82, his movements had slowed considerably from his younger days, but he maintained a certain quiet, dignity that seemed increasingly rare in the modern world. His grey hair was neatly combed, his plaid shirt buttoned precisely to the collar, and his khaki pants pressed despite the early morning flight. Nothing about his appearance suggested he was anything but an ordinary elderly traveler. The security checkpoint buzzed with the typical morning rush. Business travelers checking watches, families corralling excited children, college students with oversized headphones oblivious to the organized chaos around them. Frank observed it all with calm detachment, a man accustomed to waiting, to observing, to blending into the background. He had arrived 3 hours early for his flight to San Diego, knowing his arthritic knees would slow his progress through the sprawling terminal. TSA agent Derek Powell was having a particularly difficult morning. His alarm had failed to go off, resulting in a rushed preparation and skipped breakfast. His supervisor had reprimanded him for arriving 4 minutes late to his shift, and the coffee machine in the break room had produced something closer to warm dishwater than actual coffee. Now, 3 hours into his shift, his patience had worn dangerously thin. "Next!" Powell called out sharply, barely looking up as Frank shuffled forward. "ID and boarding pass." Frank carefully extracted his driver's license and printed boarding pass from the inside pocket of his jacket, movements deliberate and unhurried. He handed them to Powell with a polite nod. "San Diego?" Powell asked, glancing at the boarding pass. "Visiting family?" "Something like that," Frank replied softly, his voice carrying the slight rasp of age. Powell handed back the documents. "With a cursory examination, proceed to the scanner. Remove shoes, belt, jacket, and all metal objects. Laptops and electronics larger than a cell phone go in separate bins." Frank nodded again and moved toward the conveyor belt. He carefully removed his worn leather belt, the simple wristwatch his late wife had given him on their 40th anniversary, and began to unbutton his jacket. His fingers, stiffened by arthritis and the lingering effects of old injuries, made the process slower than the brisk efficiency the system was designed for. Behind him, a businessman in an expensive suit sighed loudly, checking his watch with exaggerated movements. 2 agents over, a family of 5 was being processed in the time it took Frank to remove his jacket. "Sir," Powell called from his position, voice sharp with impatience, "you need to move along. You're holding up the line." Frank didn't respond verbally, just nodded again and tried to speed up his movements, which only made his fingers fumble more with the small buttons of his jacket. The businessman behind him made another theatrical display of checking his watch. "Some of us have places to be," he muttered, loud enough for Frank to hear. Powell stepped out from behind his podium, approaching Frank with the aggressive efficiency of someone used to commanding compliance. "Sir, remove all metal objects. You're holding up the line," he repeated, louder this time. "Do you need special assistance? Because if you can't manage the security process independently, you should have requested help at check-in." Frank finally managed to remove his jacket, revealing a simple white shirt underneath. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Just need a moment with these buttons." "I said move it," Powell snapped, loudly enough that heads turned throughout the checkpoint area. "Place your items in the bin and proceed to the scanner." Frank's eyes remained fixed on the floor as he placed his jacket, belt, and watch in the grey plastic bin. From his pants pocket, he removed a small wooden box, approximately 4 inches square, and placed it carefully on top of his jacket in the bin. "What's that?" Powell demanded, pointing at the box. "Just a keepsake," Frank replied. "Nothing metal." Powell's eyes narrowed. "It needs to go through the X-ray. Any electronics inside?" Frank shook his head. "No electronics." The businessman behind Frank had now moved to another line, muttering about efficiency and consideration for others' time. But the damage to the morning's atmosphere had been done. Frank felt the weight of impatient stares as he finally removed his shoes and placed them in a second bin, then shuffled in his stocking feet toward the body scanner. The scanner operator, a younger agent named Melissa Chen, noticed Frank's difficulty walking and offered a small smile. "Take your time, sir. Step onto the marked footprints when you're ready." Frank nodded gratefully at this small kindness and carefully positioned himself in the scanner, arms raised as instructed. The machine hummed briefly, and Chen waved him forward. "You're all clear, sir. You can collect your belongings." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. On the other side of the security checkpoint, Frank waited for his bins to emerge from the X-ray machine. He watched as Powell, who had moved to inspect items coming through the scanner, picked up the wooden box from Frank's bin and turned it over in his hands. "Sir, what's in this box?" Powell asked, his tone suggesting he'd found something suspicious. "Just a medal," Frank answered simply, "and some old photographs." Powell's expression shifted to one of official suspicion. "I'll need to inspect the contents. Please step over to the secondary screening area." Frank felt a familiar tightness in his chest, not fear, but a deep weariness. He had experienced this kind of treatment before, the automatic suspicion directed at anything out of the ordinary pattern. He followed Powell to a small table set apart from the main security line. "Open it," Powell instructed, placing the wooden box on the table. With careful movements, Frank lifted the lid of the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded blue velvet, lay a medal attached to a blue ribbon with white stars. Unmistakably the Medal of Honor, the highest and most prestigious military decoration that could be awarded to a member of the United States Armed Forces. Beside it lay 3 faded photographs. One of a much younger Frank in military uniform, another of a group of soldiers standing before a helicopter, and a third of Frank receiving the medal from a president long since deceased. Powell stared at the contents, his expression unchanging. "Is this yours?" he asked, his tone suggesting he doubted it could be. "Yes," Frank replied simply. "You're claiming this is your Medal of Honor?" Powell's voice carried a distinct note of disbelief. "I don't claim anything," Frank said quietly. "It just is what it is." Powell reached for the medal, and Frank's hand shot out with surprising speed to stop him, fingers closing firmly around the agent's wrist. "Please don't touch it," Frank said, his voice suddenly carrying an authority that belied his age and apparent frailty. "Not with those gloves. Not like that." Powell jerked his hand back, startled by both the action and the transformation in Frank's demeanor. "Sir, I need to verify. Is there a problem here?" A new voice interrupted the exchange. Both men turned to see a tall, distinguished man in a TSA uniform with supervisor insignia approaching their table. His name tag identified him as Mitchell Davis, security manager. "Just a routine inspection, sir," Powell began. "This passenger has what appears to be a military medal, and I was about to verify—" Davis's eyes had already moved to the open box, and what he saw there stopped him mid-stride. He stared at the Medal of Honor for a long moment, then shifted his gaze to Frank's face, studying it intently. Captain Francis Simmons, Davis asked, his voice suddenly hushed with recognition. Frank nodded once, neither confirming nor denying the use of his former rank. Davis immediately straightened his posture and, to the astonishment of Powell and the travelers nearby, snapped to attention and rendered a perfect military salute. "Sir, it's an honor to meet you. James Mitchell Davis, former Master Sergeant, United States Army, 10th Mountain Division." Frank returned the salute with the practiced ease of someone for whom the gesture had once been as natural as breathing. "At ease, Master Sergeant," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "It's just Frank these days." Davis lowered his hand but remained standing straight. "Agent Powell," he said without turning his head, "do you have any idea who this man is?" Powell shook his head, confusion evident on his face. "He's just a passenger with a military medal." "Not just any medal," Davis corrected, his voice carrying enough authority that several nearby travelers had stopped to watch the interaction. "And not just any man. This is Captain Francis Simmons, recipient of the Medal of Honor for actions during Operation Enduring Freedom, one of the most decorated helicopter pilots in modern military history." Powell's face drained of color as the implications of his behavior began to dawn on him. Davis turned back to Frank. "Captain Simmons, I apologize for any disrespect shown to you by our staff. May I ask what brings you through Reagan National today?" Frank carefully closed the wooden box, his weathered hands moving with deliberate precision. "Memorial dedication at Miramar tomorrow. They're naming a training facility after my co-pilot, Lieutenant Rodriguez. He didn't make it back." Davis nodded solemnly. "Michael Rodriguez? I remember reading about him. 23 years old," Frank said quietly. "Pulled 3 wounded Marines from a burning helicopter after we were shot down. Got them all to safety before the fuel tank exploded." His eyes took on a faraway look. "I was trapped in the cockpit. He could have made it clear, but he came back for me." The security manager's expression reflected deep understanding. "And you were carrying his casket in that famous photograph on the White House lawn." Frank nodded once. "His family asked me to speak tomorrow. His son is graduating from flight school next month. Never met his father." The small crowd that had gathered around them stood in respectful silence, the usual rush and impatience of airport security momentarily suspended. Powell looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor tiles. Davis turned to address the TSA agent directly. "Agent Powell, please escort Captain Simmons to the TSA lounge immediately. Ensure he has comfortable seating and anything he needs until his boarding time." He glanced at Frank's boarding pass. "And contact the airline to arrange a gate escort and priority boarding." Sir Powell, still processing the magnitude of his error in judgment, could only nod mutely. "That won't be necessary," Frank began to protest, but Davis shook his head firmly. "Sir, with all due respect, it is absolutely necessary. Not as special treatment, but as the basic courtesy and respect you've more than earned." He gestured to the wooden box. "May I ask about the medal, sir? Most recipients I've known keep them in safe deposit boxes." Frank's weathered hand rested protectively on the box. "Lieutenant Rodriguez's mother asked me to bring it. She wants his son to see it at the dedication. Says it belongs with his family now." Davis seemed to understand immediately. "You're giving your Medal of Honor to his family." It wasn't a question, but Frank nodded anyway. "Michael did the brave part. I just survived." The security manager looked like he wanted to dispute this interpretation, but recognized it wasn't his place. Instead, he turned to address not just Powell, but all the TSA agents who had now gathered nearby. "Listen up," Davis said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of a former senior NCO. "This is Captain Francis Simmons, 22 years of service, 3 combat tours. Distinguished Flying Cross, Silver Star, Purple Heart, and the Medal of Honor. He paused, making eye contact with each agent. When someone like Captain Simmons comes through our checkpoint, we show respect. We show patience. We remember that. The freedom we enjoy, the very security we're trying to provide, was purchased by the sacrifice of men and women like him. The agents nodded, many looking embarrassed by the earlier treatment Frank had received. Davis continued, "And we remember that heroes rarely announce themselves. They don't wear signs. They don't demand special treatment. They often look like ordinary people, maybe a little older, maybe moving a little slower. But they've done extraordinary things that allow us to stand here today." Frank looked uncomfortable with the attention, but stood straight. The military, bearing of decades past, briefly visible beneath the exterior of an aging man. "Now," Davis concluded, "Agent Powell will escort Captain Simmons to the lounge, and I expect every courtesy to be extended to him for the remainder of his time in this airport." Powell, thoroughly chastened, gathered Frank's belongings with newfound care and reverence. "This way, sir," he said, his earlier impatience replaced by subdued respect. As Frank prepared to follow, a young woman stepped forward from the crowd of travelers that had gathered to witness the exchange. She couldn't have been more than 25, with a backpack slung over one shoulder and tears in her eyes. "Sir," she said hesitantly to Frank, "my brother is a Marine. He's in Afghanistan right now. Would it be okay if I shook your hand?" Frank smiled, the first genuine smile since he'd entered the security checkpoint. "I'd be honored," he said, extending his hand to her. She grasped it firmly, then impulsively hugged him. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything you did, for everything you're still doing." As she stepped back, another traveler approached, an older man who identified himself as a Vietnam veteran. Then another, and another. A spontaneous receiving line formed as travelers stopped to shake Frank's hand, thank him for his service, share stories of their own military connections, or simply express gratitude. Davis watched with approval, making no move to disperse the impromptu gathering despite the potential disruption to the security flow. Some things were more important than efficiency metrics. Some moments deserved to unfold at their own pace. Powell stood awkwardly to the side, holding Frank's wooden box and suitcase, witnessing the impact of the man he had so casually dismissed minutes earlier. The business travelers who had been impatiently checking watches now waited respectfully. Parents explained in hushed tones to curious children why everyone was shaking the old man's hand. When the last person had offered their thanks, Davis stepped forward again. "Captain Simmons, I believe your flight doesn't board for another hour. Would you allow me to buy you a cup of coffee? I'd be honored to hear more about Lieutenant Rodriguez." Frank nodded, the emotion of the unexpected recognition evident in his eyes. "I'd like that, Master Sergeant. Michael deserves to be remembered." As they walked away from the security checkpoint, Davis, carrying Frank's suitcase despite his protests, the gathered TSA agents and travelers watched in respectful silence. The usual buzz of security operations gradually resumed, but something had changed in the atmosphere. People moved with more awareness of those around them, more patience for the elderly couple struggling with the scanner, more kindness toward the flustered mother trying to manage children and carry-ons simultaneously. In the airport coffee shop, Frank sat across from Davis, the wooden box placed carefully on the table between them. "You know," Frank said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully, "most days I'm invisible. Just another old man moving too slowly in a world that's always in a hurry." Davis nodded. "I understand, sir. My father was a Korean War vet. By the time he passed, most people had forgotten there even was a Korean War. He used to say the same. A thing invisible except on Veterans Day, and sometimes not even then. It's not about recognition," Frank clarified quickly. "I don't need parades or thank yous. None of us do. But there's a difference between not needing recognition and being treated like you're nothing but an inconvenience. What Agent Powell did was unacceptable, Davis said firmly. I want you to know he'll be dealt with appropriately. Frank waved a dismissive hand. He's young, probably never served, doesn't understand. He took a sip of his coffee. But he might someday. That's why I carry Michael's story with me, not my medal, his story. Because stories can change how people see the world, if you can get them to listen. Davis leaned forward. Would you tell me about that day with Lieutenant Rodriguez? Frank opened the wooden box and carefully removed one of the photographs, the group of soldiers standing before a helicopter. His weathered finger pointed to a young Hispanic man with a brilliant smile. That's Michael, 23 years old, had a wife who was 7 months pregnant when we deployed. He carried her ultrasound picture in his helmet. Said his son was going to be a pilot, just like his old man. As Frank continued his story, his voice grew stronger, the slight tremor of age fading as he recalled the details of that fateful day in the mountains of Afghanistan. He spoke of the emergency medical evacuation they were conducting, the unexpected RPG that took out their tail rotor, the crash landing on an exposed mountainside under heavy enemy fire. Michael got the 3 wounded Marines out first, Frank recounted. I was pinned in the cockpit, instrument panel collapsed on my legs. Radio was still working, so I called in our coordinates, told him to get clear with the wounded, wait for extraction. Frank's eyes took on a distant look. He got them to cover, then came back for me, under fire the whole way, used a fire extinguisher to keep the flames back, then his combat knife to cut through my harness. Davis listened intently, recognizing that he was hearing details that likely weren't included in the official reports or news stories. I told him to leave me, Frank continued, his voice dropping lower. Told him it was an order. He just smiled that smile of his and said, with respect, Captain, that's a stupid order. Then he pulled me free. Frank paused, taking a long breath. We were almost clear when the fuel tank went up. Blast through us both. I woke up 2 days later in Germany. Michael never woke up at all. Davis nodded slowly, understanding filling the silence between them. And they gave you the Medal of Honor. They gave me a medal for surviving, Frank corrected gently. Michael did the brave part. He's the one who chose to go back into a burning helicopter. He's the one who disobeyed a direct order because he wouldn't leave anyone behind. He carefully replaced the photograph in the wooden box. That's why his son should have this, so he knows what kind of man his father was, the kind who ran toward danger, not away from it. Your actions that day were heroic too, Captain, Davis said quietly. You both represent the best of what service means. Frank smiled slightly. Maybe, but I've had 23 years to live with the recognition. 23 years Michael never got. 23 years his son grew up without a father. He closed the box carefully. Seems to me the least I can do is make sure his sacrifice is remembered properly. They finished their coffee in companionable silence. 2 men connected by the invisible bonds of service across different eras and experiences. When it was time for Frank's flight to board, Davis personally escorted him to the gate, carrying his suitcase despite Frank's repeated insistence that he could manage. At the gate, they found Agent Powell waiting nervously. Frank's boarding. Pass in hand. Captain Simmons, he began, his earlier arrogance completely absent. I've spoken with the airline. They've upgraded you to first class, and you'll be boarding first. Frank shook his head. That's not necessary. I'm fine where I was assigned. Please, sir, Powell said, genuine remorse evident in his voice. I behaved inexcusably earlier. This small courtesy doesn't begin to make up for it, but it would mean a lot to me if you would accept it. Frank studied the young man's face for a moment, then nodded. Thank you. I appreciate that. As the gate agent announced pre-boarding, for passengers needing extra time, Powell stepped closer to Frank, speaking in a lower voice. "Sir, I want to apologize properly. My behavior was—" He struggled for words. "Shameful, especially given what you've done for this country." Frank's expression softened. "We all have bad days, son. The measure of a person isn't in never making mistakes, it's in how you respond when you realize you've made one." Powell nodded, clearly affected by the generous response. "My grandfather served in Vietnam. He never talked about it much, but he had a display case with his medals. I used to stare at them for hours when I was a kid, making up stories about how he earned them." He hesitated. "He died last year. I wish I'd asked him the real stories while I had the chance." Understanding dawned in Frank's eyes. "That's the thing about medals, Agent Powell. They're just metal and ribbon. It's the stories behind them that matter, the people, the choices, the sacrifices. Most of those stories never get told because no one asks, or because the telling is too painful." "I won't make that mistake again," Powell promised. "Not with any veteran who comes through my checkpoint." Frank nodded, satisfied. "Then something good has come from our difficult start this morning." As first-class boarding was announced, Davis rendered another crisp salute. "Safe travels, Captain, and thank you, not just for your service then, but for what you're doing now for Lieutenant Rodriguez's family." Frank returned the salute, then extended his hand to both Davis and Powell. "Thank you both for the reminder that recognition isn't about medals or ceremonies. It's about seeing people, really seeing them for who they are and what they've done." As Frank boarded the plane, other passengers who had witnessed the events at the security checkpoint nodded respectfully or quietly thanked him. He took his seat by the window, carefully placing the wooden box on his lap, his weathered hands resting protectively over it. The flight attendant, noticing the box and sensing its importance, approached with a gentle smile. "Can I get you anything before we take off, sir?" Frank looked up, returning her smile. "Just a glass of water, thank you." "Of course." She leaned closer, speaking more quietly. "The captain asked me to tell you it's an honor to have you aboard today. He served in the Air Force before joining the airline." Frank nodded his appreciation, touched by the recognition, but still somewhat uncomfortable with the attention. As the plane filled with other passengers, he gazed out the window at the airport tarmac, his thoughts already in San Diego, rehearsing what he would say to Michael Rodriguez's son when he presented him with the Medal of Honor. It wasn't about the medal itself. It never had been. It was about passing on the legacy of courage, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to others that Michael had embodied. It was about ensuring that a young man who had never met his father would understand the extraordinary person he had been. And perhaps, Frank reflected as the plane began to taxi, it was also about reminding a world increasingly focused on speed, efficiency, and superficial judgments that true worth often lay beneath the surface, in the quiet dignity of an aging veteran, in the untold stories of sacrifice, in the moments when ordinary people made extraordinary choices. The medal would go where it belonged, to Michael's family, but the legacy it represented would continue, not in the metal and ribbon carefully nestled in its wooden box, but in the lives touched by the story behind it. In the young woman who would write to her brother in Afghanistan about meeting a Medal of Honor recipient, in Agent Powell, who would approach future veterans with newfound respect, in the passengers who had witnessed a moment of genuine recognition amid the impersonal rush of air travel. As the plane lifted off, carrying Frank toward his final mission for his long-dead co-pilot, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. Invisible most days he might be, but today he had been truly seen, and tomorrow he would ensure that Michael Rodriguez was seen as well, not just as a name on a building or a statistic of war, but as the hero he had been in that burning helicopter. 23 years ago, the young man who had refused to leave anyone behind, even at the cost of his own life. Frank Simmons settled into his first-class seat, placing the wooden box carefully on his lap as the plane climbed through the clouds. He found himself reflecting on how quickly life could change course, one moment being treated like an inconvenient obstacle, the next receiving unexpected recognition and respect. The contrast wasn't lost on him. For most of his post-military life, he had moved through the world quietly, neither seeking attention nor receiving it. Today had been different, a reminder that beneath the surface of everyday interactions lay deeper currents of connection and meaning. The flight attendant approached with his water, setting it gently on his tray table. "Captain Simmons," she said softly, "our pilot asked if you'd be willing to visit the cockpit once we reach cruising altitude. No pressure at all." Frank nodded, surprised by the request. "I'd be honored," he replied. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, the flight attendant returned to escort him to the cockpit. The pilot, a man perhaps 20 years Frank's junior, with salt and pepper hair and the unmistakable posture of military training, extended his hand as Frank entered. "Captain James Wilson," he introduced himself. "Former Air Force, C-17 Globemaster. It's a privilege to have you aboard, sir." Frank shook his hand firmly. "Frank Simmons, the privilege is mine." Captain Wilson gestured to the co-pilot. "This is First Officer Ramirez. She flew Black Hawks in Iraq." The young woman nodded respectfully. "2 tours. Nothing compared to your service, Captain Simmons." Frank smiled slightly. "Every tour matters. Every mission counts." For the next 15 minutes, Frank stood in the cockpit exchanging stories with the pilots, finding the easy camaraderie that often exists between those who have known the unique responsibility of flight during wartime. Before returning to his seat, Captain Wilson asked a question that caught Frank off guard. "Sir, we have a tradition on this route. When we have distinguished passengers aboard, especially veterans, we like to acknowledge them. Would you allow me to say a few words to the cabin about your presence with us today?" Frank's immediate instinct was to decline. He had never sought the spotlight, had always believed that duty was its own reward without need for public recognition. But something in the pilot's earnest expression made him hesitate. "It's not for you, sir," Wilson added, seeming to read Frank's reluctance. "It's for them. People need reminders of what service and sacrifice really mean in a world that's increasingly disconnected from those concepts." After a moment's consideration, Frank nodded once. "If you think it would be meaningful to others, I won't object." Returning to his seat, Frank had barely settled in when Captain Wilson's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've reached our cruising altitude of 37,000 feet, and our flight time to San Diego will be approximately 5 hours and 20 minutes. Weather conditions are favorable, and we expect a smooth journey." The routine announcement continued with the usual information about local time and temperature at their destination before taking an unexpected turn. "I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge a special passenger traveling with us today. In Seat 3E, we're honored to have Captain Francis Simmons, recipient of the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration awarded by the United States. Captain Simmons is traveling to San Diego for a memorial dedication honoring the sacrifice of his co-pilot, Lieutenant Michael Rodriguez." A murmur spread through the cabin as passengers craned their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of Frank, who kept his eyes fixed on the wooden box in his lap. "In an age where the word hero is often used casually," Wilson continued, "Captain Simmons represents what true heroism looks like, not seeking recognition, but quietly carrying the legacy of those who served alongside him. On behalf of our entire crew, many of whom are veterans themselves, we thank you for your service, Captain Simmons, and for the honor of carrying you to this important mission of remembrance." The announcement was followed by spontaneous applause throughout the cabin. Frank acknowledged it with a slight nod, uncomfortable with the attention but moved by the genuine appreciation it represented. A few moments later, a flight attendant appeared with a notepad. "Captain Simmons, I hope this isn't an imposition, but several passengers have asked if they could write notes to you. Would that be all right?" Frank looked surprised. "Notes? About what?" "Just messages of gratitude mostly," she explained, "and some have family members currently serving. They thought it might mean something to them to know they were on a flight with a Medal of Honor recipient." Again, Frank's instinct was to decline, to retreat into the privacy he had cultivated for decades. But he thought of Michael Rodriguez, how he had always been the one to connect with people, to remember that behind every uniform was a person with a story, with loved ones waiting at home. Michael would have embraced this moment, would have seen it as an opportunity to bridge the growing civilian-military divide. "That would be fine," Frank agreed quietly. Throughout the next hour, the notepad circulated through the cabin, returning to Frank filled with messages. "Thank you for your sacrifice. My son is in the army now, and knowing men like you blaze the trail gives me comfort. Sarah M. I never served, and sometimes I wonder if my generation understands what yours gave for us. Thank you for reminding us what real courage looks like. Tyler B. My grandfather never talked about career. After he died, we found his Bronze Star. I wish I'd asked him about it. Thank you for carrying these stories forward. Michelle L. Each message touched Frank differently, but collectively they reinforced something he had begun to realize at the airport, that his journey to San Diego wasn't just about honoring Michael's memory through a building dedication. It was about keeping alive the human connections that gave meaning to service and sacrifice. The passenger in the seat beside Frank, who had been quietly respectful of his privacy until now, finally spoke. I couldn't help overhearing at the airport, he said. You're giving your Medal of Honor to your co-pilot's family. Frank turned to study the man, middle-aged, wearing a business suit that had seen better days, with kind eyes that hinted at his own stories. Yes, Frank confirmed, simply. His son never met him. Seems right that he should have it. The man nodded thoughtfully. My father was in Vietnam, 101st Airborne. He never talked about it much, but he had this saying, the medals gather dust, the memories keep you awake. Frank smiled slightly. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, the man agreed. Passed 3 years ago. Cancer from Agent Orange, they think, though it took 40 years to catch up with him. He extended his hand. David Pearson. Frank Simmons, Frank replied, shaking the offered hand. I know, David said with a small smile. The whole plane knows. His expression grew more serious. Can I ask you something, Captain Simmons? Something personal? Frank nodded, sensing the genuine nature of the inquiry. How do you carry it? Not just the medal or the memories, but the responsibility of surviving when others didn't. My father never found a way to make peace with that. The question hung in the air between them, weighty with implications. Frank was silent for a long moment, considering his response carefully. I don't know that you ever fully make peace with it, he finally said, his voice low and measured. For years, I felt guilty for being the one who came home, felt like I was living on borrowed time, like I had to justify my survival by doing something extraordinary with the years I had, that Michael didn't. David listened intently, recognizing that he was hearing something rarely shared. Eventually, Frank continued, I realized that the best way to honor those who didn't come back wasn't to punish myself for surviving, but to live fully and purposefully with the time I was given. He ran his weathered fingers over the wooden box. Michael died, making sure I had that chance. The worst disrespect to his memory would be to waste it in guilt and regret. That's profound, David said quietly. I wish my father had found that perspective. It didn't come easily, Frank admitted. And it didn't come quickly. Took years of darkness before I saw that light. David hesitated before asking his next question. What turned it around for you? Frank's gaze shifted to the window, to the clouds passing below them. Teaching, he said after a moment. After I retired from the military, I became a flight instructor. Taught young pilots for almost 20 years. A smile touched his lips. There's something healing about passing on what you know, about seeing the next generation take flight, literally and figuratively. He turned back to David. Every pilot I trained was carrying a little piece of Michael's legacy forward, though most of them never knew it. His techniques for managing stress in the cockpit, his checklist habits, his way of thinking 3 steps ahead, I taught all of it. Kept him alive in that way. That's a beautiful tribute, David observed. It wasn't meant to be a tribute, not consciously, Frank clarified. It was just the best way I knew to fly. But looking back now, I can see that it was my way of making sure something of him continued beyond that mountainside in Afghanistan. Their conversation was interrupted by the return of the flight attendant, who handed Frank a thick stack of notes from other passengers. Captain Simmons, we've had to start a second notepad. I've never seen anything like this in 15 years of flying. Frank accepted the notes with a quiet thank you, genuinely moved by the outpouring. As he began to read through them, David excused himself to use the restroom, giving Frank a moment of privacy with the messages. One note in particular caught his attention, the handwriting clearly that of a child, complete with a carefully drawn American flag. Dear Mr. Hero, my name is Emma and I am 9 years old. My mom says you saved people and got a special medal. I want to be brave like you when I grow up. Thank you for keeping us safe. P.S. My dad is a soldier too. He is in a place called Afghanistan right now. Frank carefully folded the note and placed it in his pocket rather than returning it to the stack. Later, he would ask a flight attendant to help him find Emma and her mother among the passengers. As the flight continued toward the west coast, Frank found himself engaged in conversations with various passengers who approached his seat respectfully to share their own connections to military service. A grandfather who had stormed Normandy, a sister currently deployed with the Navy, a teacher who made it a point to invite veterans to speak to her students each year before Memorial Day. Each interaction reinforced what had begun at the airport security checkpoint, a reminder that beneath the often impersonal, hurried surface of modern life, people still hungered for meaning, for connection to values larger than themselves, for stories that illuminated the best of what humanity could be, even in the darkest circumstances. 3 hours into the flight, Captain Wilson's voice came over the intercom again. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some turbulence ahead. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts until we've passed through this rough patch. The plane began to bounce and shudder as it encountered the promised turbulence. Most passengers reacted with the typical tension such moments provoke. White-knuckled grips on armrests, nervous glances exchanged, a few audible gasps at particularly sharp drops. Frank, however, remained calm, his hands steady on the wooden box in his lap. The young mother across the aisle, clutching a frightened child of about 7 to her side, noticed his composure. "You're not scared?" she asked, her own voice tight with anxiety as the plane lurched again. Frank offered a reassuring smile. "No, ma'am. This is nothing compared to flying a helicopter through a sandstorm with enemy fire below." His matter-of-fact tone and steady presence seemed to calm both mother and child. The little girl studied him with wide eyes. "Were you really in a war?" she asked. "I was," Frank confirmed. "More than one, actually." "Were you scared then?" The child persisted, momentarily forgetting the turbulence in her fascination. Frank considered the question seriously, giving it the respect it deserved. Yes, he answered honestly. Being brave doesn't mean not feeling fear. It means doing what needs to be done, even when you're afraid. The mother gave Frank a grateful look as her daughter absorbed this concept. That's what I tell Lily about. The monsters under her bed, she said. That being brave means facing them, not never being scared of them. Your mother is very wise, Frank told the child solemnly. The best kind of courage is the kind that acknowledges the fear but doesn't let it make the decisions. As the plane continued to bounce through rough air, Frank found himself sharing simple stories with Lily, not of combat or danger, but of the beauty he had seen from helicopter cockpits, sunrise over desert mountains, the coastline of Greece, appearing through morning mist, the northern lights viewed from altitude during a training exercise in Alaska. By the time the turbulence subsided, Lily had forgotten her fear entirely, captivated by Frank's descriptions of the world as seen from above. Her mother mouthed a silent "thank you" to Frank as the seatbelt sign dinged off and normal service resumed. It was my pleasure, Frank assured her. My granddaughter is about her age. Never get to see her enough. Where does she live? The mother asked. Oregon, Frank replied. My son's a forest ranger there. They try to visit once a year, but it's not easy with his schedule. This small revelation that the decorated veteran before them was also simply a grandfather who missed his granddaughter seemed to complete the human connection that had begun during the turbulence. As the flight entered its final hour, Frank excused himself and made his way to the lavatory. When he returned to his seat, he found a flight attendant waiting for him with an unexpected request. Captain Simmons, we have a young passenger in. Coach who's been too shy to approach you directly. Her name is Emma. She wrote you the note with the flag drawing. She's traveling with her mother to San Diego to meet her father, who's returning from deployment tomorrow. Would you be willing to visit with them briefly? Frank remembered the child's note and nodded immediately. Of course. Following the flight attendant to the coach section, Frank found himself facing a nervous-looking girl with blonde pigtails and a woman whose exhausted expression spoke volumes about the challenges of solo parenting during a deployment. The moment Emma saw Frank approaching, she whispered something urgently to her mother, who smiled encouragingly. Emma, the flight attendant said gently, this is Captain Simmons. He wanted to thank you personally for your beautiful note. The child stared up at Frank with awe. Are you really a hero? She asked in a whisper. Frank carefully knelt beside her seat, bringing himself to her eye level despite the protest from his aging knees. I'm just a soldier who did his job, Emma. The real heroes are people like your dad, who serve every day far from their families, and people like your mom, who keep everything together while they're gone. Emma's mother blinked rapidly, clearly, fighting tears at this acknowledgement of the often overlooked sacrifices of military families. My dad's coming home tomorrow, Emma announced proudly. He's been gone for a really long time. I know, Frank said. Your mom must be a very strong person to take care of everything while he's been away. Emma nodded solemnly. Sometimes she cries at night when she thinks I'm sleeping, but she's always brave in the morning. The mother looked momentarily mortified, but Frank met her eyes with understanding rather than pity. That's what real courage looks like, Emma. Feeling afraid or sad, but getting up the next day and doing what needs to be done anyway. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, a challenge coin from his old unit, one of several he carried. This is for you, he told Emma, pressing it into her small hand. It's called a challenge coin. In the military, these are given to recognize special achievements or to welcome someone into a unit. Emma examined the coin with reverence, running her finger over the raised emblem of a helicopter silhouetted against mountains. When your dad comes home, Frank continued, you can show him this and tell him you're part of a special unit too, the unit of brave kids who keep things together while their parents serve our country. I think he'll understand exactly what that means. Emma clutched the coin tightly, her expression solemn with the responsibility of this new belonging. "I will," she promised. Frank turned to Emma's mother. "When does your husband return?" "Tomorrow afternoon," she replied. "He's been in Afghanistan for 14 months, extended deployment due to personnel shortages." Frank nodded, understanding the toll such extensions took on families. "If you don't mind my asking, what unit?" "3rd Battalion, 7th Marines," she answered. A look of recognition crossed Frank's face. "They've been operating in Helmand Province, near where my helicopter went down all those years ago." He paused. "Would it be an imposition to ask which company he's with?" "Echo Company," she said. "He's a staff sergeant, Ryan Collins." Frank's expression shifted subtly. Staff Sergeant Collins, tall fellow, scar above his right eyebrow, speaks with a slight Texas drawl. Emma's mother stared at Frank in astonishment. "You know Ryan. Our paths crossed briefly during my last visit to active duty bases in Afghanistan, about 3 years ago. I was there as part of a veteran outreach program." Frank smiled at the coincidence. Small world, as they say in the service. "The smallest," she agreed, clearly moved by this unexpected connection. "He mentioned meeting a Medal of Honor recipient during that tour." "That was you?" Frank nodded. "We spoke about helicopter extraction protocols. He had some excellent insights that I brought back to the training programs." Emma looked between the adults, trying to follow this revelation. "You know my daddy?" she asked Frank, her voice filled with wonder at the possibility. "I had the honor of meeting him," Frank confirmed, "and I can tell you that he's a very brave and very smart soldier. You should be very proud." "I am," Emma declared confidently. "He's the bravest daddy in the whole world." Frank smiled. "I believe that's absolutely true." Before returning to his seat, Frank wrote down his contact information for Emma's mother. "The memorial dedication I'm attending is at Miramar tomorrow morning. If your schedule permits, you and Emma would be welcome to attend. And if Staff Sergeant Collins is available, I'd be honored to reconnect with him." "That's very kind," she said, clearly touched by the invitation. "I can't promise anything. It will depend on his processing schedule. But we'll try." As Frank made his way back to his seat, he felt a deepening sense of purpose about his journey. What had begun as a solemn mission to honor Michael's memory by transferring the Medal of Honor to his family was expanding into something broader. A recognition that the web of connection between those who served stretched across generations, across units, across the artificial boundaries of rank and time. The remainder of the flight passed quietly. Frank alternated between reviewing his prepared remarks for the dedication ceremony and reflecting on the unexpected connections he had made throughout the day, from the confrontation at the security checkpoint to the conversations with fellow passengers to the remarkable coincidence of meeting the family of a soldier he had encountered years before. As the plane began its descent into San Diego, Captain Wilson made one final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare for landing, I'd like to once again acknowledge Captain Francis Simmons, Medal of Honor recipient, traveling with us in Seat 3A. Captain Simmons will be attending a memorial dedication at Marine Corps Air Station Miramar tomorrow morning, honoring Lieutenant Michael Rodriguez, who gave his life saving others." Wilson paused before continuing. "For those interested in paying their respects, the ceremony is open to the public and begins at 10 a.m. Details can be found on the Miramar MCAS website. Sometimes the greatest honor we can give our fallen heroes is simply to remember them." Frank listened to the announcement with mixed emotions, appreciation for the respect shown to Michael's memory, but also a lingering discomfort with being the focal point of such attention. As the plane touched down on the runway, he carefully secured the wooden box in his jacket pocket, preparing to disembark. When the seatbelt sign dinged off for the final time, Something unexpected happened. Instead of the usual rush for overhead bins and hasty push toward the exits, the passengers remained seated. The cabin was silent as the flight attendant's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, as a sign of respect, our crew would like to allow Captain Simmons to deplane first. We ask that you remain seated until he has exited the aircraft." Frank felt a wave of emotion at this simple but profound gesture. As he gathered his small bag and rose from his seat, the passengers throughout the cabin stood as well, not pushing toward the aisle, but standing in place, offering a silent tribute. Captain Wilson had left the cockpit and now stood at the aircraft door. As Frank approached, the pilot rendered a perfect salute. "Safe travels, Captain Simmons. And thank you, not just for your service then, but for what you continue to give by carrying these stories forward." Frank returned the salute, then impulsively extended his hand. "Thank you for understanding the importance of remembrance, Captain Wilson. Michael would have appreciated it." As Frank stepped from the aircraft into the jet bridge, he was surprised to find it lined with airport personnel and several active-duty Marines in uniform, an impromptu honor guard that had formed while the plane was taxiing to the gate. The senior Marine present, a lieutenant colonel, judging by his insignia, stepped forward and saluted. "Captain Simmons, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Harris, executive officer at Miramar. When we received word you were arriving today, several of our personnel requested permission to greet you at the gate. I hope you don't mind this informal welcome." Frank returned the salute, genuinely moved by the gesture. "Not at all, Colonel, though I'm just here to honor Lieutenant Rodriguez. The recognition belongs to him." Harris nodded understanding. "We're aware of your intention to present your Medal of Honor to the Rodriguez family tomorrow. It's an extraordinary gesture that has deeply touched everyone at Miramar." He gestured to the Marines standing at attention along the jet bridge. "Many of these men and women serve in units that have benefited from the extraction protocols developed after your incident. Some might not be here today if not for the lessons learned from that day. This perspective that Michael's sacrifice and Frank's survival had created ripples that continued to save lives decades later, struck Frank with new force. He had always viewed the medal as a personal burden, a reminder of the friend he couldn't save. The idea that their story had become part of a legacy that protected new generations of service members shifted something fundamental in his understanding. As Frank walked through the jet bridge, each Marine rendered a salute, which he returned with increasing emotion. At the gate area, he found a small crowd of travelers and airport staff who had paused in their hurried journeys to witness this unexpected ceremony. Among them stood a distinguished man in his early 40s, wearing a civilian suit, but with the unmistakable bearing of a career military officer. Beside him was a young man of about 20 in a Navy flight student's uniform, his features strikingly similar to the photographs of Michael Rodriguez that Frank carried in the wooden box. As Frank approached, the older man stepped forward. "Captain Simmons," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm Carlos Rodriguez, Michael's brother, and this is Matthew, Michael's son." Frank stood very still, taking in the presence of the family he had expected to meet only at tomorrow's formal ceremony. "Mr. Rodriguez," he managed finally. "Matthew, I didn't expect—" "How did you know I was arriving today?" Carlos smiled slightly. "Word travels fast in military circles, Captain. When we heard you were flying in today, and why, we wanted to be here, to thank you personally before the official ceremony tomorrow." Young Matthew Rodriguez stepped forward, extending his hand with the confidence of his father, but with eyes that held uncertainty. "Sir," he began formally, "I've grown up hearing stories about my father and about you, about what happened that day." He swallowed hard. "I wanted to meet you away from the ceremony, to thank you for keeping his memory alive all these years." Frank took the young man's hand, seeing in him echoes of his father, the same determined set of the jaw, the same clear gaze. "Your father was the finest pilot and the finest man I ever served with," he said simply. "Not a day goes by that I don't think of him." Matthew nodded, clearly struggling with emotion. "They tell me I fly like him. Same instincts, same feel for the aircraft." Pride mixed with sadness in his voice. "I'm graduating from flight school. Next month. Naval aviation." "He would be so proud of you," Frank said, his own voice rough with feeling. "So incredibly proud." Carlos Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Captain Simmons, we understand you're planning to present your Medal of Honor to Matthew at tomorrow's ceremony. We're deeply honored by the gesture, but—" Frank tensed slightly, wondering if the family would refuse the gift, if perhaps his intention had been presumptuous. "But," Carlos continued, "we believe that medal was earned through your courage, as well as Michael's sacrifice. It belongs with you." He glanced at his nephew. "Matthew feels the same way." The young man nodded confirmation. "Sir, what would honor my father most isn't transferring a medal, but knowing that his sacrifice mattered, that it saved lives including yours, and that you went on to live a life worthy of that sacrifice." Frank stood very still, absorbing these words that so closely echoed his own thoughts over the decades. "I've tried," he said finally. "Every day I've tried to live a life that would make him proud, to justify his choice to come back for me." "You have," Matthew said with conviction. "The flight instructors at Pensacola still teach your emergency protocols. Your joint extraction strategies are standard curriculum now. The lives you've saved through those programs, that's my father's legacy too." Frank looked between the two men, seeing in them the continuation of Michael's spirit in ways he hadn't anticipated. The medal had been a symbol to him, of loss, of obligation, of a debt he could never fully repay. But standing here, facing Michael's son and brother, he began to understand that the true legacy had never been about the medal at all. The terminal at San Diego International Airport buzzed with the usual activity, but around Frank, Carlos, and Matthew, a small bubble of stillness had formed. Other travelers sensed the gravity of the moment unfolding and respectfully gave them space, moving around the three men like a river flowing around stones. "There's something I'd like to show you," Matthew said, breaking the emotional silence. "If you have time before you need to get to your hotel." Frank nodded. "I have all the time in the world." Carlos smiled. "Matthew has a surprise that I think you'll appreciate, Captain Simmons. Our car is just outside." As they walked through the terminal, Frank was struck by how naturally Matthew fell into step beside him, unconsciously matching his pace to accommodate Frank's slower gait. It was the kind of instinctive consideration that couldn't be taught, the same natural awareness of others that Michael had possessed. "My father kept journals during his deployments," Matthew explained as they walked. "My mother gave them to me when I turned 18. Reading them was like finally meeting him, hearing his voice for the first time." Frank glanced at the young man with interest. "I didn't know Michael kept journals." "He was more introspective than most people realized," Carlos said. "Behind that easy smile and Texas charm, my brother was always observing, processing, making sense of the world around him." Outside, the California sunshine greeted them, warm and bright even in late afternoon. Carlos led them to a nearby parking structure where a modest SUV waited. As they drove away from the airport, Frank found himself studying Matthew's profile, marveling at the genetic echoes of his old friend preserved in his son's features. "He wrote about you," Matthew said suddenly, turning slightly in the passenger seat to address Frank. "In the journals, about your leadership, your precision as a pilot, your calm under pressure." A smile touched his lips. "And about how you'd give him grief for his country music playing in the cockpit." Frank laughed softly, the sound carrying decades of memory. Those twangy ballads drove me crazy. I was more of a jazz man myself, but he'd insist it helped his concentration. He knew it annoyed you, Carlos interjected with a knowing grin. That was half the fun for Michael. He always said you flew better when you were slightly irritated, kept you sharp. This revelation struck Frank with unexpected force. The idea that Michael's musical choices had been partially strategic, a good-natured provocation to keep his captain at peak performance. It was exactly the kind of subtle psychological insight his co-pilot had often demonstrated. "Where are we headed?" Frank asked, noticing they were driving north, away from downtown San Diego. "Miramar," Matthew answered. "There's something at the base I need you to see before tomorrow's ceremony." They drove in companionable silence for a while, the radio playing softly in the background. Frank found himself relaxing in a way he rarely did with strangers, though these men weren't truly strangers. They were extensions of the man who had been his closest friend during the most intense period of his life. "May I ask you something?" "Captain," Matthew said, breaking the silence. "Something personal about that day." Frank nodded. "Of course." In his last journal entry, my father wrote that he was having premonitions, that he'd dreamed 3 nights in a row about fire and couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Matthew's voice held careful neutrality. "Did he mention any of this to you?" Frank's breath caught slightly. This was something he had never shared with anyone, not even during the official debriefings after the incident. "The morning of our last flight," he said slowly, "Michael was quieter than usual. During pre-flight checks, he said something odd. He said, 'If anything happens today, promise me you'll make it count.' I asked what he meant, and he just smiled that smile of his and said, 'Nothing specific, just one of those feelings.'" Frank paused, the memory vivid even after all these years. "I didn't think much of it at the time. In combat zones, many soldiers have moments of premonition. Most come and go without incident, but later, after, I've always wondered if he somehow knew." Carlos nodded thoughtfully. "Michael always had an uncanny sixth sense. Even as kids, he could feel when storms were coming before the weather report, knew when someone was in trouble before the phone rang. Our grandmother called it the knowing." "Does it bother you?" Matthew asked quietly. The possibility that he might have anticipated what would happen, but went on the mission anyway. Frank considered the question carefully. "No," he said, finally. "If anything, it makes his courage even more remarkable. Fear is the natural response to danger we can see coming. Facing it anyway, that's the definition of bravery." They were approaching the main gate of Marine Corps Air Station. Miramar now. Carlos pulled into the visitor lane, where a Marine guard approached the vehicle. After checking their IDs and a brief radio confirmation, they were waved through with respectful nods. "They're expecting us," Carlos explained. The base was alive, with activity, Marines moving purposefully between buildings, aircraft being serviced on distant tarmacs, the occasional roar of a jet taking off. Carlos navigated the roads with the familiarity of someone who had visited many times before, eventually pulling up before a modern building with Rodriguez Advanced Flight Training Center emblazoned above the entrance. Frank stared at the sign, momentarily speechless. "This is the facility being dedicated tomorrow." Matthew nodded. "Officially, yes, but it's been operational for 6 months already. We wanted you to see it in action, not just during a ceremony." Inside, they were greeted by a Marine major who introduced himself as the facility director. "Captain Simmons, it's an honor, sir. We've been looking forward to your visit." The entrance hall featured a large photograph of Lieutenant Michael Rodriguez in his flight suit, standing beside the helicopter he and Frank had flown together. Beside it hung a detailed account of the mission that had claimed his life, including his posthumous Silver Star citation. Frank approached the display slowly, reaching out to touch the frame of Michael's photograph. "You captured his smile perfectly," he said softly. "He always looked like he knew something the rest of us didn't." "That's exactly what my mom always says," Matthew remarked, coming to stand beside him. The Major led them through a security door into the heart of the facility. "What we've developed here is the most advanced helicopter flight simulation and emergency response training program in the military," he explained. "Based largely on the protocols Captain Simmons helped develop after the Rodriguez incident." They entered a large room dominated by 6 state-of-the-art flight simulators. Marine pilots in various stages of training occupied several of the units, while instructors monitored their performance from nearby stations. On the far wall, painted in bold letters, was a quote: "The difference between disaster and survival is often measured in seconds and decisions. Train for both." Captain Francis Simmons, Medal of Honor recipient. Frank stopped in his tracks, staring at his own words. "I said that during a training lecture at Quantico 15 years ago. I had no idea anyone remembered it." "More than remembered," the Major said. "It became the founding philosophy of this program. Here we don't just train pilots to fly under optimal conditions. We deliberately create the worst possible scenarios, the ones nobody wants to think about but everyone needs to prepare for." Frank watched as a simulation played out on one of the larger screens. A helicopter taking enemy fire, losing tail rotor function, the pilot executing the exact emergency landing procedure Frank had developed after his own crash. "That's the Rodriguez protocol," Matthew said, pride evident in his voice. "Every pilot in all 4 branches of service learns it now. Conservative estimates suggest it's saved over 300 lives in the past 2 decades. Frank absorbed this information with growing wonder. All these years he had carried the weight of Michael's sacrifice as a personal burden, a debt he could never repay. He had never fully appreciated how their shared experience had transformed military aviation training, creating ripples that extended far beyond his individual survival. "We have something else to show you," Carlos said, gesturing for Frank to follow. They proceeded to another section of the building, where a glass-walled room housed what appeared to be a memorial. Inside, displayed with museum-quality lighting and reverence, were artifacts from the crash site, the shattered pilot's helmet Michael had worn, identified by the small ultrasound photo still miraculously intact inside its liner. A twisted piece of the helicopter's control panel, the combat knife he had used to cut Frank free from his harness. "How did you recover these?" Frank asked, astonished. The crash site had been in contested territory, deemed too dangerous for a thorough recovery. "Operation at the time. 10 years ago," the Major explained. "A joint special operations team was in the area and made a detour to document the site. 5 years later, when relations with the local government had improved, a formal recovery mission retrieved what remained. The knife was still embedded in the harness cutting point, exactly where Lieutenant Rodriguez left it." Frank moved closer to the display case, his reflection ghosting over the preserved artifacts. The knife especially held his attention, the physical link between life and death, the tool that had given him the future that Michael would never have. "There's one more thing we'd like you to see," Matthew said softly. "The heart of the facility." They led Frank to an elevator that took them to the building's 2nd floor. Emerging into a wide hallway, they approached a set of double doors marked Simulation Control Center. Inside was a large stadium-like room with tiered seating facing a central digital projection area. Currently empty of personnel, the space had the hushed importance of a church between services. "This is where we run the integrated simulations," the Major explained. "Multiple aircraft, Ground forces, command elements, all training simultaneously for complex emergency scenarios. It's the most advanced system of its kind anywhere in the world. Matthew guided Frank to a specific seat, in the front row marked with a small bronze plaque. Frank leaned down to read the inscription, "Reserved for the Rodriguez Legacy Instructor. Leave no one behind." "Every class that comes through this facility," Matthew explained, "has a designated Rodriguez Legacy Instructor, someone specifically responsible for teaching the human element of emergency response. The technical skills matter, of course, but what my father did that day wasn't about technical proficiency. It was about moral courage and split-second ethical decisions." Frank ran his fingers over the inscription, deeply moved by this recognition of the principles that had guided Michael's final actions. "He would be honored," he said simply, "though he'd probably be embarrassed by the attention." Carlos laughed softly. "That's exactly what I said when they proposed all this. Michael never wanted the spotlight, but some stories need to be told, again and again, because they remind us who we aspire to be at our best." "Captain Simmons," the Major said, "we've left this seat open today because we were hoping you might consider becoming our first official Rodriguez Legacy Instructor. Not full-time, of course, but perhaps visiting several times a year to work directly with our pilots in training. No one is better qualified to speak to the legacy Lieutenant Rodriguez left behind." Frank stared at the Major in surprise. "I'm 82 years old," he said. "Surely you'd want someone more current with today's technology and tactics." "Technology changes," Matthew said. "Tactics evolve. But the essential human choice my father made, to go back into that burning helicopter, for you, that's timeless. That's what we want these pilots to understand, from someone who lived it." Frank fell silent, considering the unexpected invitation. For decades, he had carried Michael's memory as a private responsibility. The thought of transforming that burden into a shared legacy of helping to prepare new generations of pilots for the moral as well as technical challenges they might face stirred something long dormant within him. "I would be honored," he said finally, "though I'm not sure how many years I have left to contribute." "Every minute you can give would be invaluable," the Major assured him. "We've already had inquiries from the Air Force and Navy about sending their instructors here to observe the program. What began as a Marine Corps initiative is expanding into a joint service training approach." As they continued touring the facility, Frank noticed something remarkable happening within himself. The weight he had carried for 23 years, the mingled grief, guilt, and obligation that had been his constant companions, was not disappearing, but transforming. What had been a solitary burden was becoming a shared mission. What had been a debt impossible to repay was revealing itself as a legacy already in motion. Later, as they stood in the fading afternoon light outside the building that bore Michael's name, Frank finally opened the wooden box he had carried from Washington. The Medal of Honor gleamed in the California sunshine, its blue ribbon vibrant against the faded velvet lining. "I still want Matthew to have this," Frank said, looking at Carlos. "Not because I feel it belongs to Michael more than me, but because it represents something larger than either of us. It's a tangible link to a story that deserves to be remembered." Matthew looked at the medal, then at Frank, his expression thoughtful. "What if there's a third option?" he suggested, "something that honors both your wishes and ours." "I'm listening," Frank said. "The medal could remain here, at the training center, in a special display that tells both your stories, my father's sacrifice and your continued service. Not changing hands, but serving a larger purpose by inspiring everyone who trains here." Frank considered the suggestion, seeing its wisdom. The medal had always been uncomfortable as a personal possession, a reminder of a day he would rather not have survived alone, but as a teaching tool, as a symbol of the larger values that had guided both him and Michael. It made perfect sense. With one condition, Frank stipulated, that it's displayed alongside Michael's silver star, as equals, different medals, same courage. Carlos nodded, clearly moved by the solution. I think that would be perfect. That evening, after checking into his hotel, Frank found himself sitting on the balcony of his room, watching the sunset over the Pacific Ocean. His phone rang, the coordinator for tomorrow's ceremony confirming final details. After concluding the call, he noticed a text message from an unknown number. Captain Simmons, this is Amanda Collins, Emma's mother from the flight. Staff Sergeant Collins's processing schedule has been expedited, and he will be released tomorrow morning. We would be honored to attend the dedication ceremony, if the invitation still stands. Frank smiled, pleased by this unexpected connection. He texted back a confirmation and the relevant details, then sat back in his chair, marveling at how his solitary journey had transformed into a web of meaningful relationships in just a single day. His phone rang again, this time his son in Oregon. Dad, is everything okay? I just got a call from someone at Miramar saying you've agreed to become an instructor for some new program there. Frank laughed softly. News travels fast in the military. Yes, it's true in a manner of speaking. I'll be visiting a few times a year to work with young pilots. Nothing too strenuous. At your age? His son sounded concerned. Dad, you're 82. Shouldn't you be thinking about slowing down, not taking on new commitments? Age is just a number, Thomas, Frank replied. And sometimes the most important journeys begin when you least expect them. Besides, I feel more alive today than I have in years. Because of the ceremony tomorrow? Partly, Frank acknowledged, but more because I've finally understood something I've been missing all these years. Michael's sacrifice wasn't just about saving my life in that moment. It was about everything that would come after. The pilots I would train, the protocols we would develop, the lives that would be saved decades later. He wasn't just pulling me from a burning helicopter. He was creating a legacy that would extend far beyond either of us. There was a thoughtful silence on the other end of the line. That's profound, Dad. I've never heard you talk about it that way before. I never saw it that way before, Frank admitted. Too focused on the personal debt, I guess. Too caught up in survivor's guilt to see the bigger picture. Well, I'm glad you're seeing it differently now, his son said warmly. And I'm proud of you for taking on this new role. Just don't overdo it, okay? Sarah and Emily are counting on you being around for her graduation next year. Frank smiled at the mention of his granddaughter. I wouldn't miss it for the world. And Thomas, maybe you and the family could come visit while I'm teaching at Miramar sometime. I think you'd find it interesting, and I'd like you to meet some people who've become important to me. We'd like that, Dad, really. After ending the call, Frank returned to his contemplation of the sunset. The sky had transformed now, deepening, from gold to crimson to purple as the sun slipped below the horizon. It reminded him of the sunsets he and Michael had witnessed from their helicopter, those brief moments of transcendent beauty amid the tension of combat missions. A knock at his hotel room door interrupted his reverie. Opening it, he found Matthew Rodriguez standing in the hallway, holding a thick binder. I hope I'm not intruding, the young man said, but there's something I wanted to share with you before tomorrow's ceremony. Frank welcomed him in, curious. Not intruding at all. What's on your mind? Matthew placed the binder on the coffee table. These are copies of all my father's journals. My mother and I would like you to have them. He opened the binder to reveal neatly preserved pages covered in handwriting Frank immediately recognized as Michael's. I've tagged entries where he mentions you specifically, but I thought you might want to read all of them eventually. Frank stared at the unexpected gift, deeply moved. Matthew, I don't know what to say. This is incredibly generous. He wrote a lot about you, Matthew continued, about the things he learned from you, the kind of leader you were. Reading these journals helped me understand not just who my father was, but who you were to him. A mentor, a friend, someone he respected enormously. Frank carefully turned a page, reading a random entry. Rough mission today. Heavy fire near Kandahar. Simmons got us through with that eerie calm of his, like he's got ice water in his veins during emergencies. Watched him talk a panicked Marine through applying a tourniquet over the radio while simultaneously flying evasive maneuvers. Don't know how he compartmentalizes like that. Hope I'm half the officer he is someday. Emotion welled up in Frank's throat. I had no idea he felt this way. He was always so confident, so naturally skilled. I never thought he saw me as someone to emulate. Matthew smiled. He did. Very much so. He turned to another tagged page. This one's from 3 weeks before the crash. Frank read the entry, his hands trembling slightly. Had that dream again, fire everywhere, woke up sweating. Can't shake the feeling something's coming. Talked to Maria on video call yesterday. She showed me the latest ultrasound. A boy, going. To name him Matthew. Told her if anything happens, make sure he knows I loved him before I ever met him. That's the hardest part of being here, knowing I might miss his whole life, but also knowing why I'm here, why it matters. If my son grows up in a world where Simmons's daughters can sleep safely, where the guys in our unit make it home to their families, it's worth the risk. Just hope I'm there to teach him to fly someday. Frank closed the journal, overcome. He knew, he said softly. He really did know something was coming. And he still boarded that helicopter. Matthew nodded. That's what makes his choice so powerful to me. Not that he rushed back into danger on impulse, but that he had already thought deeply about what he was willing to risk and why. He paused. In a way, he did teach me to fly. Through these journals, through the legacy of the protocols you developed together, through the example he set that day. Frank looked at the young man before him, the son Michael had never met but had loved fiercely, now grown into a Navy pilot about to embark on his own career of service. Your father would be so proud of you, Matthew, so incredibly proud. I hope so, Matthew said. Sometimes I wonder if I can live up to his example. That's not how legacy works, Frank said gently. It's not about replicating what came before. It's about carrying forward the core values while finding your own path. Michael didn't save my life so I could live exactly as he would have. He saved me so I could continue my own journey, informed by his sacrifice but not defined by it. Matthew absorbed this wisdom, visibly processing its implications for his own life. Thank you for that perspective. It helps. They spent the next hour going through more journal entries, Frank sharing his memories of the incidents Michael had described, filling in details that only he could provide. It was a form of communion across time, the father present through his words, the son learning him through shared stories, the friend reconnecting with a voice long silenced. When Matthew finally rose to leave, he appeared lighter somehow, as if the evening had resolved something important within him. I should let you rest before tomorrow's ceremony. It's going to be a full day. Frank walked him to the door. Thank you for the journals, Matthew, and for helping me see Michael's legacy, our legacy, in a new light. After Matthew left, Frank returned to the balcony with the binder of journals. The night was clear, stars emerging in the darkening sky over the Pacific. He opened to the first entry, dated shortly after Michael had joined his unit, and began to read. Time slipped away as he immersed himself in his friends' thoughts, seeing their shared experiences through Michael's eyes, understanding for the first time how their partnership had looked from the other side of the cockpit. Somewhere around midnight, he'd reached the final entry, written the evening before their last flight. Something feels different tonight, can't explain it. That dream again, but more vivid this time. Told Simmons to make it count if anything happens. He gave me that look, the one that says I'm being dramatic. Maybe I am, but if there's one thing I've learned in this life, it's that nothing is guaranteed. Not tomorrow, not next year, not the chance to see my son grow up. All we have for certain is this moment and the choices we make within it. If this journal is ever read by someone after I'm gone, especially my son, I want them to know this. I regret nothing. Every choice that brought me here was mine. Every risk I've taken has been with full awareness, and if I don't make it home, know that whatever happened, I acted according to my deepest values. No one dies wishing they'd been less courageous, less committed, less willing to stand for what matters. Wheels up at 600. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. Simmons with his strategic mind, me with my instincts. The best damn flight. Team in theater, if I do say so myself. And if trouble finds us, well, we've beaten the odds before. Frank closed the journal, tears flowing freely now. Michael's final written words seemed to reach across the years, offering not just closure, but a kind of benediction, an affirmation that his sacrifice had been made with full awareness and in alignment with his deepest values. "We did face it together, old friend," Frank whispered to the night sky. "And tomorrow, we'll make sure your story continues to touch lives for generations to come." He slept peacefully that night for the first time in 23 years. The weight of an unpayable debt finally lifted from his shoulders, replaced by the more bearable responsibility of carrying forward a legacy larger than himself, a legacy built not on guilt or obligation, but on the enduring power of courage, sacrifice, and the choices that define us in our most challenging moments. Morning arrived with the gentle persistence of California sunshine, filtering through the hotel room curtains. Frank awoke, feeling remarkably refreshed, despite having stayed up late reading Michael's journals. He moved through his morning routine, with deliberate care, shower, shave, and finally donning his formal dress uniform for the first time in nearly a decade. The uniform still fit, though perhaps a bit more snugly than it once had. He secured each button with precision, adjusted his tie with practiced movements, and finally pinned the Medal of Honor to his chest. Today would be the last day he would wear it. After the ceremony, it would remain at the Rodriguez Training Center, where it could serve a purpose greater than gathering dust in a drawer or burdening his descendants with its weight. As he regarded himself in the mirror, Frank saw not just an elderly veteran, but the continuation of a story that had begun in fire and sacrifice 23 years ago and continued to unfold in unexpected ways. The man reflected back at him was both the young captain who had survived against impossible odds and the aging instructor who would soon be passing those hard-won lessons to a new generation. A knock at his door announced the arrival of his escort, a young Marine lieutenant sent to drive him to Miramar for the ceremony. The lieutenant's eyes widened slightly at the sight of the Medal of Honor on Frank's chest, and he rendered a sharp salute. "Captain Simmons, sir, Lieutenant Jackson, it's an honor to escort you today." Frank returned the salute. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I appreciate the courtesy." During the drive to the base, Frank noticed the lieutenant glancing at him, occasionally in the rearview mirror, clearly struggling with whether to speak or maintain professional silence. "Something on your mind, Lieutenant?" Frank asked kindly. The young man hesitated. "Sir, I hope you don't find this inappropriate, but I've studied your case extensively. The Rodriguez Protocol is the foundation of our emergency extraction training. I just wanted to say thank you, not just for your service then, but for the lives your experience has saved since." Frank nodded, understanding the lieutenant's mixture of professional respect and personal curiosity. "The protocol isn't just mine, Lieutenant. It was born from what Michael Rodriguez did that day, his decision to come back, the techniques he used to extract me under fire. I just had the opportunity to analyze and formalize what worked. Yes, sir, the lieutenant agreed. That's actually what makes it so powerful as a training tool. It's not just theoretical, it's tested in the most extreme conditions imaginable. They drove through the main gate of Miramar, where additional security had been positioned for the day's event. The dedication ceremony for the Rodriguez Advanced Flight Training Center had drawn significant attention. Military brass from all service branches, local officials, media, and family members of pilots whose lives had been saved by protocols developed after the Rodriguez incident. As they approached the facility, Frank could see the gathering crowd, hundreds of people, far more than he had anticipated, arranged in orderly sections before a podium adorned with the Marine Corps emblem. A large object, covered in a ceremonial cloth, stood to the side, presumably the dedication plaque or statue to be unveiled. The lieutenant parked in a reserved area and came around to open Frank's door. "Sir, they're waiting for you in the preparation room inside. Mr. Rodriguez and his nephew are already there, along with the base commander and several distinguished guests." Frank nodded, taking a deep breath to steady himself before emerging from the vehicle. As he walked toward the building, several Marines snapped to attention, rendering salutes which he returned automatically. The military courtesy so deeply ingrained it transcended his personal discomfort with formal recognition. Inside, he was escorted to a small conference room where Carlos and Matthew Rodriguez waited, along with several high-ranking officers. The base commander, a full colonel with 3 decades of service evident in his campaign ribbons, stepped forward immediately to greet him. "Captain Simmons, welcome to Miramar. I'm Colonel Hayes. We're honored to have you with us today." He gestured to the others in the room. "I believe you know the Rodriguez family already. May I introduce General Westfield, Commandant of the Marine Corps, Admiral Chen, Chief of Naval Operations, and Secretary Reynolds from the Department of Defense." Frank shook hands with each dignitary, maintaining his composure despite the unexpected presence of such high-level officials. The Secretary of Defense, a tall woman with keen eyes and a firm handshake, regarded him with particular interest. "Captain Simmons, I've been looking forward to meeting you. The Rodriguez training protocol has become a cornerstone of our joint service emergency response doctrine. What began as a helicopter extraction procedure has evolved into a comprehensive approach to high-risk personnel recovery across all branches and environments." Frank nodded, still processing the scope of influence stemming from what he had always considered a deeply personal tragedy. "I'm gratified to hear that, Madam Secretary, though I never anticipated such widespread adoption. The best innovations often come from the most difficult circumstances," she replied. "Your ability to transform personal tragedy into life-saving protocols exemplifies the resilience and adaptive thinking we strive to instill in all our service members." Colonel Hayes approached with a tablet displaying the ceremony schedule. "Captain Simmons, I wanted to review the program with you. After the opening remarks and national anthem, we'll have brief comments from our distinguished guests, followed by the Rodriguez family. You're scheduled to speak just before the unveiling of the memorial. Is that acceptable?" Frank reviewed the schedule, noting he was allotted 10 minutes for his remarks. "Yes, that's fine, Colonel." "There's one other matter," Hayes continued, lowering his voice slightly. "We've had an unexpected addition to the guest list. Emma Collins, the young girl you met on your flight yesterday, is here with her parents. Staff Sergeant Collins was processed early this morning and specifically requested to attend when he learned of the ceremony." Frank smiled, pleased by this development. "I'd very much like to see them after the ceremony, if that can be arranged." "Of course, sir. They're seated in a reserved area near the front." As final preparations were made, Frank found himself momentarily alone with Matthew Rodriguez, who seemed both nervous and resolute in his dress whites. "How are you feeling about all this?" Frank asked gently. Matthew gestured toward the window where they could see the gathering crowd. "Overwhelmed, honestly. I never expected so many people. My father would have been mortified by all the attention." Frank chuckled. "Yes, he would have. Probably would have found some excuse to be flying a mission somewhere far away during his own ceremony." This observation brought a genuine smile to Matthew's face. "That's exactly what my mother said. This morning, she couldn't attend, still finds these military events too difficult, but she said to tell you that she's grateful for everything you've done to keep his memory alive." Before Frank could respond, an aide appeared at the door. "2 minutes, gentlemen. We're ready to begin." As they moved toward the stage, Frank noticed that Matthew carried a small case similar to the wooden box that had held his Medal of Honor. Sensing Frank's curiosity, Matthew explained, "My father's silver star, for the joint display we discussed yesterday." They emerged onto the stage to respectful applause, taking their seats as the ceremony began, with the presentation of colors and national anthem. Frank sat straight-backed, despite the protest from his aging joints, surveying the assembled crowd with quiet amazement at the turnout. Military personnel in dress uniforms, civilian officials, families with children, veterans of various eras, all gathered to honor a legacy that had grown far beyond what he could have imagined. The formal speeches proceeded with military precision. General Westfield spoke of the strategic importance of advanced training protocols in modern warfare. Admiral Chen emphasized the cross-service applications of the Rodriguez method. Secretary Reynolds focused on the human element, how procedures, developed from real sacrifice, created ripple effects that saved lives decades later. When Carlos Rodriguez approached the podium, a hush fell over the crowd. His speech was brief but powerful, focusing not on the technical achievements or military significance, but on his brother as a person, the boy who had always dreamed of flying, the young man who had found his calling in service, the husband and expectant father who had written home about the honor of serving alongside men like Francis Simmons. "Michael used to say that the measure of a person isn't found in their greatest achievements," Carlos concluded, his voice steady, despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "It's found in their smallest decisions, the ones made when no one is watching, when there's no medal or recognition at stake, when it's just you and your conscience in the moment of truth." His last decision, to go back for his captain despite the danger, wasn't extraordinary for him. It was consistent with every small choice he had made throughout his life. As Carlos returned to his seat, Matthew stepped forward. Young and straight-backed in his Navy uniform, he embodied the living continuation of his father's legacy. "I never met my father," he began simply. "Everything I know about him comes from stories, photographs, and the journals he left behind. For most of my life, he existed for me as a collection of second-hand memories and an absence I couldn't quite define." Matthew paused, his gaze moving across the crowd before settling on Frank. "But through Captain Simmons, through his willingness to share not just the heroic moment of my father's sacrifice, but the everyday details of who he was as a pilot, as a friend, as a man, my father has become real to me. Not just a name on a memorial or a medal in a case, but a person whose values and choices continue to guide lives today." He gestured toward the training facility behind them. "This building bears my father's name, but its purpose embodies the partnership between him and Captain Simmons, the pilot who made the ultimate sacrifice and the one who ensured that sacrifice continued to save lives for decades to come. Today, as we dedicate this facility, we're not just honoring the past, we're investing in a future where the lessons learned at the cost of my father's life will protect generations of service members yet to come." As Matthew concluded to heartfelt applause, Colonel Hayes approached the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my honor to introduce Captain Francis Simmons, Medal of Honor recipient and the driving force behind the training protocols that will be taught in this facility." Frank rose slowly and made his way to the podium. He had prepared remarks, carefully written and rehearsed, but as he looked out at the assembled faces, the Rodriguez family, the military brass, little Emma Collins sitting beside a Marine staff, Sergeant who must be her father, the flight attendant from yesterday's journey, who had somehow found her way to the ceremony, he set aside his notes. 23 years ago, he began, his voice clear despite his age, I was trapped in a burning helicopter on a mountainside in Afghanistan. By all rational calculation, I should have died there. The aircraft was compromised, enemy fire was continuing, and extraction would require moving through flames that were spreading rapidly toward the fuel tanks. He paused, making eye contact with various members of the audience. Lieutenant Michael Rodriguez had already led 3 wounded Marines to safety. He had fulfilled his duty by any standard measure. No one would have questioned his decision to remain at a safe distance, to wait for the rescue team we both knew wouldn't arrive in time. No one except Michael himself. Frank's hand rested lightly on the Medal of Honor, pinned to his chest. For 23 years I've worn this medal with complicated emotions. Pride, yes, for what it represents about American values, but also a persistent question that has haunted me. Why was I the one who survived to receive recognition when Michael was the one who demonstrated the greatest courage that day? He glanced at Matthew, drawing strength from the young man's attentive presence. What I've come to understand, especially in these past 24 hours, is that survival itself can be a form of service, that sometimes the most important mission begins after the crisis has passed. Michael saved my life not as an end in itself, but as an investment in possibilities that only became clear with time. Frank gestured toward the training facility behind him. Every pilot who learns the Rodriguez protocol carries a piece of Michael's legacy forward. Every service member who makes it home because of those protocols extends that legacy further. And every life those service members touch, their families, their communities, their own acts of courage and service, becomes part of a widening circle of impact that began with one man's split-second decision on a burning mountainside. He turned slightly to address the Rodriguez family directly. "Carlos, Matthew, I've spent 23 years trying to be worthy of Michael's sacrifice, trying to repay a debt I knew could never be fully settled. What I've realized only recently is that the true honor of his memory isn't in carrying a burden of obligation, but in recognizing the gift his sacrifice represents, the gift of possibility, of continued service, of lives touched and saved, because he made the choice he did." Frank's gaze returned to the broader audience. "Today, as we dedicate this facility, I'm also dedicating myself to a new understanding of legacy. Not as weight to be carried, but as light to be passed forward. Not as debt to be repaid, but as investment to be multiplied." He carefully unpinned the Medal of Honor from his chest. "This medal has been in my possession for 23 years. Today, with the blessing of the Rodriguez family, it will find its permanent home here, alongside Michael's Silver Star, in a joint display that honors not just 2 individuals, but the eternal truth that our greatest achievements often come through partnership, through mutual respect, and through decisions made in moments when character reveals itself most clearly." Frank stepped away from the podium, walking to where Colonel Hayes stood beside the veiled memorial. Together with Matthew and Carlos Rodriguez, they pulled away the covering to reveal not the expected plaque or statue, but an elegant glass case already prepared to house both the Medal of Honor and the Silver Star, with a backdrop featuring side-by-side photographs of Frank and Michael in their prime. Between the photographs was inscribed 2 pilots, 1 mission, endless impact. As Frank carefully placed the Medal of Honor in its new home, Matthew positioned his father's silver star beside it. The two medals gleamed under the specialized lighting, symbols not just of past heroism, but of an ongoing commitment to saving lives through improved training and protocols. The ceremony concluded with a flyover by a formation of helicopters, the same model Frank and Michael had flown together, now updated with safety features directly influenced by the lessons learned from their crash. As the aircraft passed overhead, Frank stood at attention, rendering a final salute not just to the memory of his co-pilot, but to the continuing mission they now shared across the boundaries of life and death. After the formal proceedings ended, Frank found himself surrounded by well-wishers, veterans who wanted to shake his hand, active duty personnel who had trained using his protocols, family members of pilots whose lives had been saved by the techniques he had developed. He greeted each one with genuine attention, no longer uncomfortable with the recognition, but seeing it now as acknowledgement not just of his survival, but of the productive use he had made of the years Michael's sacrifice had given him. Captain Simmons? A tentative voice broke through the crowd. Frank turned to find Emma Collins standing with her parents, her mother from the plane, and a Marine staff sergeant still bearing the dust of Afghanistan on his boots, clearly having come directly from his processing center to the ceremony. "Emma," Frank greeted her warmly, "and you must be Staff Sergeant Collins." The Marine snapped to attention and saluted. "Yes, sir. Ryan Collins, 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines. It's an honor to meet you, sir." Frank returned the salute, then extended his hand. "The honor is mine, Staff Sergeant. Welcome home." Collins shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, sir. When I heard about this ceremony, and that you'd met my wife and daughter on your flight, I couldn't miss it. Your extraction protocols saved 3 of my men during an ambush last year. I've wanted to thank you in person ever since." This direct connection, from Michael's sacrifice to Frank's protocols to lives saved in contemporary conflicts, struck Frank with particular force. It was one thing to hear about the statistical impact of the Rodriguez protocol. It was another entirely to look into the eyes of a Marine who had seen its effects firsthand. "I'm just grateful they worked when needed," Frank said simply, "though the credit belongs to many people, especially Lieutenant Rodriguez." Emma tugged at her father's sleeve, whispering urgently. Collins smiled and nodded encouragement. "Captain Simmons," Emma said, her voice small but determined, "I wanted to show you something." She carefully opened her hand to reveal the challenge coin Frank had given her on the plane. "I showed it to my daddy, just like you said, and he said it. Means I'm really brave." Frank knelt to the child's level, despite the protest from his knees. "Your father is exactly right, Emma, and I bet he's very proud of how you and your mom handled everything while he was away." Emma nodded solemnly. "He said, 'We're the bravest girls in the whole world.'" "I couldn't agree more," Frank assured her, rising with a slight wince that didn't escape Staff Sergeant Collins's notice. "Sir, would you join us for lunch after this?" Collins asked. "We'd be honored, and I'd appreciate the chance to hear more about the training facility. I'm considering flight school myself when my current enlistment ends." Before Frank could respond, Matthew Rodriguez appeared at his elbow. "Captain Simmons, I hope I'm not interrupting, but there are some people from the Navy flight program who would like to meet you. They're interested in adapting the Rodriguez protocol for carrier operations." Frank found himself at the center of intersecting circles of influence and connection. The veteran instructor, the family directly impacted by his protocols, the son of his co-pilot now carrying forward a new dimension of their shared legacy. It was a moment that embodied everything the dedication ceremony represented, not just honoring the past, but actively building the future. "Staff Sergeant Collins," Frank said, making a quick decision, "why don't you and your family join us? I think you'd find the carrier operations discussion interesting, especially if you're considering flight school. And Matthew, I'd like you to meet the Collins family. Staff Sergeant Collins has first-hand experience with the Rodriguez Protocol in combat operations. As the expanded group moved toward the meeting area, Frank found himself walking between generations. Matthew on one side representing the continuation of Michael's legacy, Emma skipping ahead while occasionally looking back to ensure her father was still there, Collins and his wife following closely behind, their expressions reflecting the precious miracle of a family reunited after deployment. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of meaningful conversations, new connections, and deepening understanding of the impact one helicopter crash had generated across decades and service branches. Frank met pilots whose lives had been saved by the protocols, instructors who had incorporated his techniques into various training programs, and officers responsible for updating and expanding the methodology as technology evolved. By late afternoon, as the formal activities wound down, Frank found himself sitting quietly with Carlos Rodriguez in a small garden area behind the training facility. The two men, connected by loss and legacy across 23 years, watched as Matthew demonstrated simulator features to Staff Sergeant Collins and several other interested Marines. "He's so much like Michael," Carlos observed, nodding toward his nephew. "Not just in appearance, but in how he connects with people. Michael could walk into any room and within minutes have everyone feeling like they'd known him for years." Frank nodded, recognizing the same quality. It's a rare gift, essential for a good officer, the ability to build trust quickly. Carlos turned slightly to face Frank directly. "I want to thank you for something specific, beyond everything else you've done for our family. Thank you for giving Matthew a living connection to his father. The journals were important, of course, but your stories, your first-hand memories, they've helped him understand Michael as a person, not just a hero in a photograph." "It's been healing for me, too," Frank admitted. "For years, I kept those memories mostly to myself, feeling that sharing them somehow diminished their sacredness. Now I understand that sharing them actually honors Michael more fully, ensures his impact continues beyond what either of us could have imagined." They fell silent for a moment, watching as Emma Collins joined the group around the simulator, her father lifting her up to see the controls, while Matthew explained something that made the child laugh with delight. "Life continues," Carlos said quietly. "Not always as we expect or plan, but it finds a way forward." Frank nodded, feeling the truth of this observation in his bones. Michael understood that, I think. His last journal entry, he wrote about making his choices with full awareness of the risks, about acting according to his deepest values, regardless of the outcome. "That sounds like him," Carlos agreed. He always had unusual clarity about what mattered most. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, Colonel Hayes approached their bench. "Captain Simmons, Mr. Rodriguez. I hope I'm not interrupting, but there's something I'd like to show you before you leave today." They followed the colonel to a small conference room, where a laptop was set up for a video call. On the screen was an elderly woman with Michael's eyes and Carlos's smile, their mother, now in her 90s, too frail to attend the ceremony, but determined to participate from her nursing home in Texas. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Frank said, emotion catching in his throat. "It's an honor to finally meet you, even if only virtually." The woman's eyes brightened with recognition. "Captain Simmons, after all these years." Her voice was thin but clear. "I've wanted to thank you personally for keeping my son's memory alive, for making sure his sacrifice continued to mean something." "Your son saved my life, Mom," Frank replied simply. "Everything I've done since has been an attempt to honor that gift." She nodded, her eyes wise with the perspective that comes only from great age and profound loss. "Michael wrote to me about you, you know. Said you were the kind of officer who led from the front, who never asked his men to take risks he wouldn't take himself. He respected that greatly." Frank hadn't known this, and the revelation touched him deeply. He was the finest co-pilot I ever flew with, ma'am. His instincts were X'd up next. You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.